as a leader, taking that time, it doesn't take a lot of time to invest in understanding how your team work, how they think, how they communicate. It will just give you so much more perspective when you're managing them. And I
Mm.
think, again, as we have, particularly going into a more globalized workforce where you're managing people from different ages, different backgrounds, different walks of life, different cultures, you've got to really, as a leader, invest in really understanding your team, how to communicate with them, how to give them feedback, and how to give them praise.
Welcome to Future Fit Leadership, a podcast for emerging, experienced and executive leaders to build community, grow capability and future focus their career pathways. There has been a global shift in how we lead, and our conversations with leaders and executives explores the skills, strategies and mindsets that is needed to thrive in this ever-evolving landscape of the future. So whether you are a seasoned executive, an aspiring leader, or simply curious about the future of leadership, we are here to give you practical insights to unlock your potential, change the status quo, and break open our assumptions on how work works. Produced in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives, Future Fit Leadership is your place for bite-sized learning for executives hungry to make a change. Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. I hope wherever you are listening to this podcast, you are well. Scott Millar is not your typical CEO. At just 25 years old, he has spent nearly a decade already running his own company, mentoring business leaders who are twice his age and helping organizations bridge one of the biggest workplace divides we are facing right now: how to actually work with, not just around, Generation Z. In this episode of Future Fit Leadership, I sit down with Scott. He is a future-focused founder known for bringing colour, curiosity, and a whole lot of Gen Z energy to every boardroom he walks into. He launched Bop Industries as a high school project and has since turned it into one of Australia's most exciting and insightful voices on the future of work, education, and leadership. And before we even dive into Gen Z, let's pause for a moment and zoom out. Every generation that enters the workforce wants to do things differently. I'm in my 50s. I watch my parents stay in one job for life, loyal to the company, rarely questioning the system. Then came my generation and we pushed hard. I've worked long hours, climbed ladders, burnt out more times than I care to admit, and have become intimately familiar with the always-on mentality. My kids, they've seen that and they want none of it. Scott helps us unpack exactly why. We talk about why the 9 to 5 is dying a slow, painful death and why Generation Z isn't interested in clock watching or cubicle culture. They want meaning, flexibility, a sense of mattering, and they're not afraid to walk when it's missing. Scott gives us a window into what younger generations really want at work. And it's not beanbags and free snacks. It's purpose, feedback, and leadership that listens instead of lecturing. One of my favorite moments in this conversation, when Scott explains how he uses love language hacks with his team. Yes, you heard right, love languages, in a professional setting. And before you roll your eyes, it actually makes perfect sense. Words of affirmation, public praise, acts of service, taking something off their plate during crunch time. It's all about tuning into how people feel valued and showing up accordingly. Simple, clever, and human. Scott also flips the script on mentoring. For years, we've been telling young people to find a mentor. But what if leaders, especially those of us with a few decades in our careers, started looking at reverse mentors? People like Scott who can challenge our assumptions, decode the TikTok generation, and help us design cultures that don't just tolerate Gen Z, but are also co-creating with them. There's something deeply hopeful about Scott's approach. He's not here to burn it all down, but he is here to build something better. A workplace where curiosity trumps hierarchy, where impact beats presenteeism, where every generation brings something to the table and actually gets a seat. So if you've been wondering how to connect across generations, lead with more humanity, or just finally understand what the hell quiet quitting actually means, this is the episode for you. Here is the bold, brilliant and wonderfully future-focused Scott Millar. Well, hello, Scott Millar. Welcome to Future Fit Leadership. How are you this morning?
I'm good, thanks, Sadhna. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Well, I'm super excited to have this conversation because I'm not going to spoil it for our listeners, but as we unfold this journey, people will realize what an incredible journey you have had to date, and you are still so very young. But quite often I ask people, tell us a little bit about yourself from when you were growing up, etc. But I'm going to go straight into your question because you actually started a business at the age of 14 with a group of friends. How in the world did that happen? Like, what motivated you to do that?
Look, that's a really great question. And I think if I think back to that time, that was 10 years ago, it really for me was looking for opportunities to access that most young people my age didn't get that opportunity to access. I think for myself as a young person, I was quite frustrated, I guess, with what it was like to be in school, where there was always that concept that to do anything exciting, to make any real impact, you had to go through your high school studies, then go to university, get a degree, get into industry, and then you had to really wait until you were in sort of a few decades into your career before you could really start making an impact, having your say, sharing your voice.
That hasn't
And I
changed
think
though, has it, Scott, really?
no,
It has
I
not
don't think
changed.
so. But I do think entrepreneurship and innovation, it is leveling that playing
Mm.
field. And I think particularly as we start to see these Gen Zs and digital natives progressing through their careers, getting out into industry, they're looking at other opportunities to be able to make an impact, to be able to build businesses and shape a career that they're excited about at a really early age.
Mm.
So for me, that was that real motivator. And I never considered myself a business student. I was actually quite interested in performing arts and commercial aviation. But I really saw for me entrepreneurship and innovation as a vehicle to bring my ideas to life, develop my skills, grow my experience as a teenager doing something a little bit more exciting than I guess working at KFC or Woolworths, for example.
What do your parents think about this? I mean, here you are coming home at the age of 14 saying, I'm going to start a business. What did they say to you? Go to university, son?
Absolutely. I think they were a little nervous. I was a pretty high performing academic student. And I think my parents sort of saw that and said, well, look, why don't you just keep your head down, get good grades, get a good graduating mark, go to a good uni degree, and then climb that corporate ladder? Because I think for so many of us, that is the pathway that's modeled as a safe, successful, traditional pathway. And I think as we see more young people entering industry these days, they're starting to explore things like freelancing. They're starting to explore entrepreneurship and side hustles and digital nomad pathways. And that is a little scary because there is no tried and tested model for that. And I think we as a society still really value that get good grades, go to university, climb the corporate ladder, that sort of mentality. So I think my
Yeah.
parents were a little bit nervous, I must admit, when I started going against the grain.
It's an interesting point you bring up because I think one of the challenges leaders have today in business is a lot of the younger generation, which we'll talk about in our conversation a little bit later on, actually do have a side hustle. So not only am I working in your business from 8:30 to 5 o'clock, but on weekends or after 5 o'clock, I actually have a side hustle that I do something else with. And I think that's the future of work, that people will have multiple jobs or roles, or, we call it a side hustle now. I'm sure that terminology would change because it doesn't sound very serious, but that's a real head shift for leaders, isn't it, to manage young people in that world?
Absolutely. I do agree. I think the younger generation coming through have got quite an entrepreneurial appetite, but I
Mm.
do think whilst leaders can see this as a challenge, it provides some really exciting opportunities. I was reading a report just the other day that said that 70% of young professionals in Australia under the age of 35 would consider working freelance as opposed to a traditional 9 to 5 career. And I even think for those young people that aren't necessarily they don't have side hustles going on, they're looking at how can they commoditize their skills, saying, well, look, instead of working from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday for one organization, how can I do 2 days a week with one company, a day a week with another, 2 days a week here? And I think for them, it gives them a lot of flexibility to work the hours that they want to work, the projects they want to work on when they want to work on them. But I think as a leader as well, it gives you so much more flexibility in how you manage your team instead of having to sort of get that lock in permanent contract with a full time staff member that might be good at sort of 50, 60% of their job, but might be sort of falling behind in some of the other areas. You can say, well, look, I don't really need a full time copywriter, but I might just hire someone 2 days a week to help me out with that. And look, I maybe don't need a full time digital marketer, but I can get someone just a day a week to help me with that. And I think that provides leaders a really exciting opportunity to reimagine what HR looks like in that
Mm.
future of work.
And when we talk about hybrid, I don't think hybrid is just about the hours we work or where we work. I think hybrid is the whole of work. Who does what when and how we do it and how often we do it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it gives so much rise as well to the concept of globalized teams. I was
Mm.
even just reading a report the other day and talking to some young people around that concept of being a digital nomad. And I think now more than ever, for that younger generation of Gen Zs and millennials coming through, they're wanting to have a bit more work-life balance where they can work from, say, Sydney for 3 months and go to Singapore for 3 months, then London, then New York, and sort of say, well, look, I'll log on, I'll do my 8 hours, but I'm going to sort of do it from a co-working space. I'm going to do it from a beach in Bali. I'm going to do it from a share house with a few friends. And I think it gives the employers as well that opportunity to say, well, look, instead of just being able to hire within 100 kilometers of where my office is, I can hire the best people for the job regardless of their location, regardless of whether they're working from a capital city, a regional hub, or somewhere overseas.
So, Scott, after you started BOP or BOP Industries at school at the age of 14, you then went into the hologram business. Tell us more about that. I have visions of being able to create myself as a hologram and send it off to meetings. I wish I could do that, and then it would give me more time. But clearly, that's not what it is. But tell us more about holograms.
Absolutely. So for me, I started my business selling hearings at markets and got it to a point where, as a 15-year-old, I was selling a few hundred, a few thousand hearings every month on different online e-commerce platforms. And I said at that point, look, hearings have been great. They've made me a bit of money. I'm making some pocket money, but I want to do something really exciting. And I think at that point, I'd always understood or always thought that to do something exciting was to work in the tech space. But to work in the tech space, you had to be a software developer. And that's just not me. Anyone that knows me knows I could not code a website to save my life. I'm very creative, I'm very hands on, but I'm not a coder by any means. So, what I did was I jumped on YouTube. I typed in cool tech tutorials and I found a tutorial teaching me how to make holograms like you see in Star Wars and Iron Man out of nothing but some cutout CD cases, a bit of tape, and a YouTube video. Essentially, after a bit of tinkering and some work with my teachers at school, I had created a series of holograms that quickly got picked up by companies wanting to use them in the events and marketing industry. So you can have a product, you can have a keynote speaker in a hologram talking to people virtually, but you might have a product that's changing color, changing shape, changing design. And I found myself working in the events and marketing industry for about 3 years, exploring new and emerging technologies in the marketing space, looking at how can we re-engage customers. Because I definitely think traditional marketing has become a little bit stale. People are becoming immune to billboards and LED screens, and brands are being challenged to reimagine how they're capturing the attention of their
Mm.
customers and finding new and exciting ways to surprise and delight that next generation of consumer that's coming through.
And so, what does a business do today? It's clearly still involved in holograms, but you do more than that now.
We do. We primarily focus on education. For myself, I found once I'd finished high school, a lot of publicity about myself and my story. And I found myself in a really unique position, which I still have the pleasure of getting to do, where I had a number of teachers reaching out from primary and high schools across the country and around the world, saying, look, we want to be preparing our young people for the future of work. But there's a great deal of conversation about AI, automation, robotics, and the emerging technologies changing the ways we live, work, and learn. How do we possibly prepare students for such an unknown future? On the flip side, I had a lot of big industry partners, organizations reaching out saying, look, how can we better understand this next generation of employee and consumer? As we touched on earlier, Generation Z, they are approaching their careers in very different ways to other generations that have come before. And
Mm.
these organizations were looking for insights on this next generation of consumer, but also this next generation of employee. So now, myself and my team, we have the pleasure of working with about 20,000 young people every single year across the country, helping them upskill with the skills that they need to be competitive in the industry, building entrepreneurial skills, innovation mindsets, and a lot of those 21st century skills that they need to be successful and thriving in this ever changing future of work. On the flip side, for myself, as a generational consultant, I get to work with leading organizations, helping them unpack the trends associated with Generation Z and Generation Alpha as future employees and future consumers, but helping leaders build intergenerational collaborations in their team, understanding that we have Gen Zs and baby boomers working together in industry. And whilst it can form some really exciting opportunities, there can be a bit of friction in teams. So I get the pleasure of getting to help leaders navigate those complex intergenerational collaborations.
And there's such critical issues in businesses, but I want to just stick with the schools program you have at the moment. Because I started to sort of think about this when I was doing some research on what your business does. And it's that sort of light bulb moment of we have a whole new generation that grew up with flicking the phone or the iPad being taught at schools by potentially a generation that may traverse two or three generations prior to that that either didn't grow up with it or, are not natively connected with it as this new generation is. And so it's really hard to teach that, isn't it? And you're doing a great job by the number of students you taking on that journey now. But how do we as a country scale that up so that it's in every school and every student has that opportunity?
That's a really great question. And I think it really comes down to the difference between digital literacy and digital confidence. You
Mm.
make an excellent point. This generation, they are digital natives. They've grown up in a world surrounded by touchscreen devices, Wi Fi, and social media. Even for myself, I'm a Gen Z. I was born in the year 2000. So I'm on the older end of Gen Zs, but growing up being born in the year 2000, Wi Fi hit the mainstream before I started primary school. The first iPhone came out when I was in year two. I think my first phone was an iPhone 4, and Facebook hit a billion monthly active users before I was old enough to get Facebook. So, therefore, for myself and for that entire generation of young people that are a similar age or younger, they don't think it's unusual to be able to pick up a piece of glass and metal in their pocket, their phone or their iPad, type in a few words and get 1,000 answers to any question they have at the press of a button. They don't think it's weird to be able to pick up that device, press a button, and talk to someone on the other side of the planet in real time. So I think what we really need to do is embrace the digital world they're growing up in. I think we see a lot of older generations saying technology is bad, the internet is bad, social media is bad. And I definitely see this with cyber safety education. A big part of my role is looking at a Gen Z's guide to cyber safety and talking to a lot of young people. That's what they've been told. It's those older generations telling them technology is, yeah, it's counterintuitive, it's counterproductive, don't do it, stay away. They, as young people, naturally are going to get into trouble. They're going to do it anyway. But then, because they've been told not to do it, they're too scared to ask for help. And quite often, those older generations, they don't know what to do to help when things go wrong. So I think it's around building that digital confidence. Digital literacy, it's following a series of steps to get to a desired outcome. Digital confidence is having the adaptability skills, those critical thinking skills, the creative thinking skills, the communication skills to embrace any new and emerging technology and to be able to confidently use it as part of their day to day. So I think that's what we need to start seeing more of in the curriculum is it's embracing technology and leaning in and saying, well, look, technology is here to stay. It's predicted that by 2030, we'll have over 50 billion smart devices connected around the world. That's any device that connects to the internet. And that's assuming every single person on the planet had equal access to tech. That's about 7 or 8 devices per person that connect to the internet. So I think we're no longer at a point where we can all walk down to the ocean, throw our devices in and pretend like tech just isn't happening. We need to be leaning into our digital world and making sure that our young people have the skill sets, the mindsets, and experiences to embrace new technology, to be able to work with emerging technologies confidently, and to be able to create with these new technologies to do new things.
Mm. Oh, look, I said my grandson's only 8 months old and he's fascinated by the mobile phone. I'll put a toy in front of him and a mobile phone. He'll go for the mobile phone every single time. In fact, I'm teaching him how to crawl by putting the mobile phone just out of reach. So he commando crawls towards it. My daughter's ready to kill me, but I see that and I kind of wonder how he's going to go at school being taught by people who didn't have those experiences.
Oh, and I think it's so interesting. The research shows that even for that generation, your grandson's generation, he'd be falling into Generation Alpha, which is those
Mm.
born between the years 2011 and 2025. And for me as a Gen Z, we've been called digital natives. Gen Alpha have been nicknamed Generation Glass, referring specifically to those touchscreen devices. And what a lot of the research shows is that for many of this generation, the first language that they learn is not any spoken language. The first language they
Mm.
learn to communicate confidently with and fluently with is technology because they are that generation that can reach down, unlock their parents' phone, and start swiping around to play with their favorite apps before they're old enough to form full sentences. And I think for those leaders out there, it poses a really interesting challenge of when this generation enter the workforce, when they've learned to communicate with technology before they've learned to communicate in a spoken language, how will they be collaborating? How will they be connecting? And how will they be communicating? Which I think is going to be a really unique challenge for leaders over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, and what's going through my mind is that we had a generation of kids who just wanted to sit in the room and play games, and they all said, "Oh, we've got hundreds and hundreds of friends." Yes, you do, but they're all online. They're not the person you're going to take the bike to the park with and have a, play in the park or climb trees and go to the beach, all the things that we did growing up. And it did potentially impact their ability to create relationships once they got into the workplace.
But I do wonder if they just create different types of relationships.
Good
I
point.
always say that if you look at any young person and how they're using technology, they're connecting, they're collaborating, and they're creating. They're
Mm,
probably spending time messaging their friends on a social media platform or direct message. They're connecting, they're keeping up with what their friends are up to, what their favorite celebrities and influencers are up to, or they're creating, they're playing a video game, they're developing a skill. So they're doing the same sort of things we do face to face, but they're doing it digitally. And I think with it, they are building some really fantastic connections. And I think that playing video games potentially with your child is the equivalent of going and kicking around a footy, for
yeah,
example, for previous generations. And I think that's where parents as well need to lean into the technology a bit more and say,
yeah.
look, let's play Fortnite together, for example, and not in a creepy, I'm going to stand 10 steps behind you and follow your character around to make sure you're not doing anything inappropriate. It's a, no, let's get in and let's play a video game together. I think that's so important for this next generation of parents as they grow up.
You know, that was a real generational comment by me, wasn't it? Making that sort of, I started to laugh when you started to answer. I was like, yep, he's right. Let's stick with the generational conversation because we've got them coming into the workforce and they're also coming to us as consumers. What do we really need to understand about them as they went into the workforce or come in as consumers into our businesses?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I'd probably break it into two parts because the trends are a bit different, looking at them as employees versus as consumers. I think if we look at them in a consumer lens, they are incredibly motivated by purpose over profit. This next generation of consumer, they really want to make the world a better place. They've grown up seeing global warming, poverty, famine, war, all of these issues continue to get worse and worse and worse. And they're incredibly well educated about that. If you look at a lot of the curriculum that's been taught over the past 10 to 15 years, those sort of current events are front and center. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, I think, as well, are a great example of that. And this generation are acutely aware of that, and they're wanting to support brands. They're wanting to buy from brands that are helping make a positive impact in some way, shape, or form. So I think that is the first thing. Every brand, regardless of what industry they're in, regardless of how big or small their business is, needs to have some sort of a social or environmental impact, helping make the world better in some way, shape, or form. As well as that, though, I think we're starting to notice shifts in how Generation Z communicates and connects. They are incredibly digital. Digital marketing is very much here to stay, and they're connecting on these digital platforms, but they're not looking for that incredibly polished brand that we've seen in the past when it comes to marketing. And I think a great example of a brand that's doing this really well and capitalizing on this is Duolingo. Now, Duolingo, for anyone that doesn't know, is a language learning app. You can download it and you can learn French, Spanish, Italian, anything like that. They've been around for a while. But essentially, Duolingo a few years ago launched a TikTok account. And brands have been on TikTok for a while. And I think when brands first started getting on TikTok, they were getting a fair bit of flack from the users on TikTok saying, look, this really polished, super salesy, really corporate sort of content is not what we want. And it was actually negatively impacting these brands by putting that out on the platform. So Duolingo said, well, look, why don't we do things differently? What if we're just here to be really authentic? We're here to entertain and we're here to engage with our audience. We're not trying to sell anything. So what they did was they created a bit of a character. The Duolingo logo is an owl. So what they did was they created an owl costume. They got an intern to dress up as the owl and just get up to all sorts of pranks around the office. The owl would be twerking on the CEO's desk when the CEO was out at a meeting. It would be chasing inactive users around the office, threatening that they should Spanish or vanish. And they'd be getting in arm wrestles with the legal team about what they could or couldn't post on the platform. And I think what's really interesting is they didn't talk about their plans. They didn't talk about their pricing, the features of their app, yet their click-through rate, which is people watching a video of an owl twerking on the CEO's desk, downloading the Duolingo app and signing up for an account, that click-through rate was 39% higher than the industry average on the platform. And I think that's what we really see for Generation Z. They're looking for that authenticity. They want to be entertained. They're not interested in that really polished corporate brand voice that we've seen in the past. And I think that authenticity is so key for appealing to Gen
Mm.
Z as consumers.
It's hard for brands to do, right? Because a lot of the times you have to, your brand image, your brand experience has to traverse many generations. And what we're talking about here is one siloed generation or couple of generations there. So it is a hard decision for brands to make to say, we're going to throw all the old ways of marketing to this new way. So how do brands create a balance in that is what I'm interested, I guess, to ask you.
That's a great question. And I think Bendigo Bank is a really great example of a brand that's done this and done this really well with their launch of Up Bank, which is one of their sub brands. Now, Bendigo Bank, very traditional big bank here in Australia, they've been around for quite a while. And I think as a Gen Z, I always think of Bendigo Bank and I'm like, oh yeah, that's my parents' and my grandparents' bank. It's a safe, it's a reliable bank. It's not super sexy, if I'm being honest, though. As a Gen Z, I don't get really excited about banking with Bendigo. But what they did was they had a look at the under 35s market and found that under 35s in Australia are increasingly mistrustful of traditional banks, the sort of big banks that we've seen in the past, because they have gotten in trouble for doing some pretty dodgy things. And also, too, Gen Z are interacting with banks in very different ways. So they said, well, look, we don't want to jeopardize the Bendigo Bank brand. They have a great brand. They've got a lot of really loyal customers that they absolutely don't want to alienate. But they know that their brand is not going to appeal to under 35s. So what they did was they launched a sub brand, a neobank called Up Bank. And what they did was they co-designed. They got young people in and said, well, look, what do you want your banking experience to look like? If we wipe the slate clean, started from scratch, what would your ideal bank look like? And they designed a bank around what under 35s are looking for. And what they've done is a number of things. Up Bank, for example, they don't have any physical branches. They found that under 35s, we don't want to go into a branch, but we'd rather have really good instant messaging support. So they've really invested in instant messaging. They've redesigned the app to make it super user friendly, and they've taken inspiration from other brands. They do a yearly wrapped report that at the end of the year, you get some fun stats and a really jazzy little report that talks about how much money you've saved, how much you've spent, where it's all gone. And they've reimagined their credit and debit cards, but really lent into digital payments and instant payments as well to help under 35s get money back from their friends when they split a bill at dinner, things like that. And I think that's just a really beautiful example with Upbank, where they were able to gain 500,000 customers within the first 4 years of them launching without jeopardizing the Bendigo Bank brand. So I think that's where brands need to consider different personas, maybe even sub brands that appeal to their different customer segments, because you are right, the different generations, they do shop in very different ways, and it is getting increasingly difficult to appeal to all of them at the same time.
Very good advice, Scott. Now, you talk a lot about emerging technologies like AI, automation, the metaverse. These are all things that are reshaping how we work. What do you think from a leadership perspective? Are we still underestimating? Because I mean, sometimes I kind of go, well, metaverse, I don't get it. I can't even see myself trying to get my head around it in a business world, right? So what are some of the things that we are underestimating that is happening in the world of technology that we should probably be considering?
Look, I
Seriously.
think you've really hit that nail on the head around AI and particularly the metaverse. I look at Apple's new Vision Pro product as an example. Now, the Vision Pro, it's less than 12 months old. It only came out in March, April last year, and it's pretty expensive. You're looking at upwards of 10,000 Aussie dollars to get the Vision Pro plus the latest Mac that you need to power it. And at the moment, I must be honest, it's pretty gimmicky. There's not a lot of real world applications to it. And I think a lot of people look at that piece of technology and they say, as if, how is this ever going to make an impact? Yet a lot of futurists and experts are predicting that the Vision Pro in a lot of developed communities, in developed organizations, will replace laptops and iPads in the next 5 years and will replace iPhones in the next 10 years. And I think people hear that statistic, but I encourage them all to think back to the iPad. The first iPad came out in 2011. That was 14 years ago. And I remember when it came out, it was pretty thick. It was pretty chunky. It didn't have a camera. It was super expensive and wasn't good for much other than really browsing the internet. And I remember at the time, there was so much criticism of the iPad saying this is expensive, it's gimmicky, it's never going to find its place. Yet now you walk into most office spaces and you'll see people writing on their iPads in meetings. You walk into schools and you can find 5-year-olds playing around with iPads and learning. You walk into workshops and you walk into industry and you'll see people carrying out repairs on planes and cars, big machinery, using the assistance of iPads. So I think when you think about the increasing rate of change, these sorts of technologies are going to become commonplace. And it's not too crazy to think that a Vision Pro might replace your laptop or your phone in the next 10 years. So I think with that, it's about not underestimating any technology. It's being willing to experiment. But I think the most important thing when it comes to technology for every leader to consider is responsible innovation. It's asking that question, just because we can, does it mean we should? And I think that's such a key piece. It's understanding the ethical implications of the technologies that you're using. It's understanding some of the unintended consequences that might come out with using a technology. And I think for leaders, there is increasing pressure to go out and buy the latest shiny thing, get the latest VR headsets, get the Vision Pro, sign up for every AI software under the sun. But I think it's about taking that step back and considering the ethics of how could this positively affect our business, but also how might this negatively affect our business, and going into it with the eyes wide open.
Knowing all you know now in the world that you work in, what is, from a standpoint of the future of work, what are some of the non-negotiables that we need to start considering for the future of work?
I think the non-negotiables for the future of work is firstly investing in intergenerational collaborations. As I mentioned previously, we have Generation Z and baby boomers working together in teams. And I've seen some teams where it's working beautifully. There's really dynamic conversation, there's truly innovative ideas. And it's the combination of the experience and the wealth of knowledge that baby boomers have with that digital native mindset of the Generation Zs coming together. But I think when done poorly, I've walked into workplaces where the baby boomers are giving Gen Z flack for being the tech obsessed, lazy, entitled generation. The Gen Zs are rolling their eyes and saying, okay, boomer, I dare you to convert a Word document to a PDF. And it can be quite toxic. And I think we're going to see even more of that spread of generations in the workforce. And over the next 20 years, as even Generation Alpha enter the workforce, different generations that communicate, collaborate, and work in very different ways. So I think a non negotiable for leaders is they've got to understand those different generations. How do they think? How do they work? How can I get the best out of them? And as a leader, you need to be differentiating your approach to each of your employees. I think the other non negotiable is flexible and hybrid working environments, understanding that as we continue to progress into the future, people are looking for more flexibility. They're not necessarily wanting to work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday in a physical office. They might be wanting to set their own hours, work the days of the week that they want to work, and they might not even want a full time position. They might prefer to work freelance. I'm working on different contracts with different organizations. I think that's another non negotiable. And I think finally, it's the need to push yourself outside of your comfort zone. One of my favorite quotes says that great things never come from comfort zones. And I think that's key for every future focused leader preparing for the future of work. It's that ability to experiment, to trial new things, to push themselves outside of their comfort zone and see what works and see what doesn't, but being able to be adaptable and flexible.
Where do you see businesses going wrong when they try and transform themselves digitally? And particularly when it comes to people, culture, and tools, if we just look at those three things.
I think the businesses where they go wrong when it comes to transforming digitally, it goes back to not listening. I think the businesses that do it well, they co-design. They co-design with their customers, they co-design with their staff, and they co-design with all of their stakeholders. And it's not a box ticking exercise. It's not tokenistic and saying, oh, yep, that's nice, but we're going to go do what we wanted to do anyway. It's authentic. It's doing that listening. It's doing that co-design, but taking those ideas and implementing them. And I think that's the key when it comes to implementing new and emerging technologies in any business.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier about the younger generation are looking for businesses with purpose. What's your advice to leaders, CEOs, boards, chairs, etc., on how they are building purpose-driven brands?
I think as far as building purpose-driven brands, again, it comes to listening. It comes to asking what they're looking for. I think Canva is a great example of this with their work around sustainability. Now, Canva put out a survey for the pandemic and said, look, what are the issues that you guys are nervous about to all of their employees and all their customers? And they found that climate change, the environment was a really big issue. So Canva set a goal to become net zero. And they didn't have to spend lots of money doing it. It was really simple initiatives. It was sourcing food served in their restaurants from local producers to limit food miles, implementing e-waste recycling programs, changing a lot of the lighting and technology in their office to be energy efficient. Really simple things that don't take a lot of time, don't cost a lot of money. They hit net zero and they said, look, we can do better. Let's become beyond net zero. And they kept investing in these initiatives. And they're now able to say, and they do broadcast it quite widely to every employee, every day you come to work, you're helping make a positive impact on the environment. And to every customer, every time you log into your Canva account, you're helping make a positive impact in your environment. So they not only reached out to their employees and customers and found out about the issues that they're passionate about, they took simple steps to fix it. It doesn't need to be expensive. It doesn't need to be complex. It can be really simple steps. And they continued pushing themselves outside of their comfort zone. So now they can have that guarantee to employees and customers that every day, just by using Canva, they're helping make the world a better place. And I think that's key for leaders wanting to create a purpose-driven organization in their team.
And, I'm just thinking as you saying all this to me that, and particularly for leaders, is the level of transparency that is available today, not just to your people, but to your customers through AI, through, a whole range of technology options and systems that we use in our businesses. The level of transparency that is now around really are the impacts, trust that people have with you as a leader and as a brand in a positive or negative way. And we will now never go back to a world where if you were the holder of information, you didn't necessarily have to share it.
Absolutely. And I think with that, there's a new generation coming through as well, or just us, I think generally as a society are becoming more aware of things like greenwashing, those really tokenistic tick and flick activities of saying, oh, great, we've invested a big chunk of money, we've done this thing. That's sustainability done. That's diversity and inclusion done. That's whatever it might be. I think for any leader, it's understanding that if you're going to do it, you need to be authentic at the end of the day. You need to be actually putting in the work, and you need to be willing to commit to long-term change. It's not just a one-off. It's not something you can do in the short term. It needs to be continuous and also embedded throughout your organization and led from the top. You as a leader have to believe in it to create that positive example for all of your employees.
I love the fact that you are so young leading an organization as you are. What advice do you have for leaders in terms of what you've learned that you do, well, you see yourself do really, really well because that's then reflected in your organization? And maybe on the flip side of that, lessons that you've learned on things that didn't go so well.
That's an excellent question. Look, I think for me, as a bit of context, I lead a team of Generation Zs. Most of my team are under the age of 30. So I'm very much a Gen Z leading a Gen Z team and try and sort of walk the walk as well as obviously talking the talk. I think for me, the most valuable tool I've learned as a leader over the recent years is love languages tests within my team. Generation Z, there is no questioning that they do need those dopamine hits. They do need that instant gratification because we have grown up in a world where you're on TikTok, you watch a video, you don't like it, you flick it, and there's another video 1 second later. So what I've done with my team is I've said, well, look, obviously we don't have unlimited resources. I can't give you a pay rise every time you do a good job, as nice as that would be, but let me figure out your love language. And for some members of my team, their love language is words of affirmation. So I just have to say to them, Sadhna, you've done a really fantastic job with that program. I really appreciate your work. Thank you so much. And that might be one-on-one or publicly praising them. Others, it's gifts. And a member of my team whose love language is gifts, it's buying them a can of Coke Zero at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when they hit that after lunch slump and just saying, hey, Sadhna, I got you a can of Coke. It cost me $3. But I really appreciate you staying in late yesterday and just getting that project done by the deadline. And for them, that's enough to say, wow, that's done a good job. Others, it might be acts of service. It might be giving them a Friday afternoon off, saying, look, finish at lunchtime on Friday, start your weekend early, or saying, look, is there something I can take off your plate to help you out in exchange for you going above and beyond? So I think that for me has been a game changer. Realizing that giving Generation Z a little bit more reassurance, maybe than other generations need for a job well done. It doesn't have to be title bumps. It doesn't need to be pay rises. It can be something as simple as a half day finish on a Friday, a can of Coke, Zero, or some words of affirmation. So I think that would be my advice for any leader looking to better understand and better manage Gen Z. I think things that maybe haven't done too well is blind confidence. I think Generation Z sometimes can be hesitant to ask questions because they feel like they know all the answers and they say, oh yeah, I'll figure it out. And I think that's realistically not just Gen Z. I think that's all of us as we've been in the early stages of our career. You sort of finish school or finish uni, go into your first job being like, I know everything. And then you end up Yep. And then you end up in a pretty precarious position because you haven't asked for help, you haven't asked the right questions, and you've just gone in guns blazing. And I think that's something I've seen a lot as well with particularly Generation Zs that I've been working with on my team. And I think as a leader, it's being aware of that. No matter how confident they seem, just stay there, be with them. Yes, let them make little mistakes, let them trip and fall and be there to pick them back up because that is how they learn. But just be aware that, yeah, they definitely have that blind confidence. So you've sort of got to be there to check their blind spots for them.
I want to go back to the love language. That is an awesome, awesome idea. And I don't think it's just unique to Generation Z. I think if somebody knew my love language and gave me that instead of, a pay rise, I'd probably be quite as happy, or a bonus, I'd be just as happy. How did you find out their love language? What did you do?
Yeah, so we did a love language test.
Yeah.
So I'm big on three things that I do, which some of them seem pretty standard, some of them seem a little crazy. Always, obviously, doing a Myers-Briggs personality test with my team when they start. I love the 16 personalities one's really good just to understand how they work and what motivates them. The other one is the love languages, and there's some great free love languages tests online. And sometimes people are a bit funny because obviously love languages you typically do with your significant other.
Correct.
But there are some great love languages for work that sort of translate everything for you. But then also even something as simple as horoscopes. I love finding out what sort of star sign team members are because it does explain a lot about people. And I just think as a leader, taking that time, it doesn't take a lot of time to invest in understanding how your team work, how they think, how they communicate. It will just give you so much more perspective when you're managing them. And I think, again, as we have, particularly going into a more globalized workforce where you're managing people from different ages, different backgrounds, different walks of life, different cultures, you've got to really, as a leader, invest in really understanding your team, how to communicate with them, how to give them feedback, and how to give them praise. And for me, I found those three tools have been really effective ways of doing that.
I want to shift to a very personal conversation, if that is okay with you. And I'll preface it with a story and you'll understand where I'm heading to. So my daughter was out at the shops today lining up for a coffee, and somebody came up and started playing with my grandson, realized that grandson boy and he had a pink beanie on. And she turned around and said to my daughter, "What are you doing putting a pink beanie on your son? He's going to grow up gay." Now, I know that you had an experience where someone in the workplace once said to you, "It's so refreshing to see a gay with a real career." And it's really sad that people today are still having those comments and conversations. But what was the impact on you when this comment was made to you?
Look, it was a really interesting experience, and I didn't expect it, if I'm being honest. This
Yeah.
particular person, I could tell they meant it as a compliment. They said what, like, we'd had a really great conversation, we'd gotten along really well, and it was sort of their way of saying, "Sort of, it was really nice to meet you," but they just thrown that comment out there. It's refreshing to meet a gay with a real career. And it sort of made me do a little bit of reflection. And I think, particularly in Australia and in these days, we have so many openly queer business leaders.
Mm.
And not just business leaders, we have openly queer medical leaders, we have entertainers, we have someone in every profession,
Yeah.
pretty much. And it really showcasing that your sexuality and how you identify doesn't limit you. But it made me realize that for so many people, they don't get that visibility. And I think, particularly in today's world as well, where we are living in a very digital world with a lot of social media, you can fall prey to your algorithm. And I think we see this with even elections as a great
Mm.
example. I know at the moment we're recording this, there's an election going on in Australia. And so often I'll chat to people and I will be going on Instagram, I'll be going on LinkedIn, I'll be going on TikTok, all the different social media platforms I use. And I'm only seeing people from my perspective. I'm only seeing people that agree with me. So then when you get an election result that you don't personally agree with, it comes as a shock because you're sort of sitting there saying, well, look, everyone I know thinks this way. How could there possibly be any other schools of thought? And I think that is the danger of technology and social media in our generation. And I think the same goes with diversity. I know for myself, as an openly queer young person in business, I see so many phenomenal business people from such diverse backgrounds absolutely kicking goals. But that conversation really reminded me that not everyone gets to see that. And I think that's where, for me, that visibility piece is so important. It's being able to show that, look, your background doesn't need to be able to limit what you're capable of. And I think that's a really key piece for me and everything I do is it's being able to say, well, look, I can be an educator, I can be a keynote speaker, I can be a consultant, and that the fact that I'm gay doesn't limit me at all. And if
Mm.
anything, I try and always advocate for the benefit of diversity on teams. Because if you look
Mm.
at any piece of research, diverse teams, diverse organizations, they perform better, they make more money, they respond to challenges more effectively than people with more, I guess, traditional schools of thought and people that all think in the same way. So I think that diversity piece is so important. But it was a really unique experience, I must admit.
Mm. How do leaders bring in more allyship into their business? You know, and you talk about diversity and inclusion, and I always say your business has got to reflect the communities that we live in, and the communities isn't made up of old white men kind of stuff, you know. So how do we create a better allyship in businesses that we lead?
I think it goes back to that point that I guess has really underscored a lot of this conversation where it's authenticity. I think, again, we're getting really aware of, even when we talk about the LGBT community, we call it pink washing. And I give an example. I was at Mardi Gras down in Sydney earlier this year, and I saw a particular bank had whipped up some gay TMs, which were essentially ATMs, but they were absolutely bedazzled to the nines. They had rhinestones everywhere. It was glitter. It was streamers. And I must admit, as someone at Mardi Gras, I thought that was absolutely fabulous. But it really did make me think. I was like, I wonder what this company's actual diversion inclusion
Yes,
strategy looks like. And
yes.
if you were to look at their executive team, do they have a diverse representation on their executive team? So I think that authenticity is key. It's before you go and do anything splashy, before you go and make a big public statement, make sure that you've actually done the work in the background and being very authentic and very open. But again, it's about being led by you as a leader. I think a great example is actually going back to my own experience in school. I remember when I was in school, I had one of my I'd come out as gay, and I had a best friend at the time who was a guy. And I remember walking through the school grounds back when I was in year 12 with my friend, and someone made a comment essentially about me and this friend and being like, oh, are you two together? Are you a couple? Because now Scott's gay. And I didn't think anything of it at the time. I just brushed it off and kept walking. And I remember that afternoon, I went to a big school. We had a few thousand students. That afternoon, probably maybe 2 hours after it happened, I was called into the principal's office with my friend that I was walking with. And as we walked in, the student that had made that comment walked out in tears. And the principal called us in and she said, look, a teacher heard this. They reported it to their manager, who reported it to me as the principal. And I just wanted to let you know that student's been suspended. If it happens again, they'll be expelled on the spot. And I just wanted to personally invite you boys in here to apologize that that happened to you in this school, and to give you my personal word that if it happens again, whoever does it will be expelled on the spot. And I think for me, that made me feel so safe, so
Seen and
accepted,
safe and
and
accepted. Yep.
because it came from the top. It wasn't, I didn't have to sort of find my own community within that school of people who were there to support me. I understood that the principal of that school, the head of that
Mm,
organization, was looking out for me, but also not just looking out for me, but for looking out for every other young
mm,
person like myself. And I think
mm,
that's for any leader wanting to create those diverse, inclusive spaces. It's about having really strict but fair guidelines and, yeah, making sure that you as a leader are seen to be visible, supporting people from diverse backgrounds.
mm. So, Scott, what's your advice to young leaders today who want to start up a business? There's probably, 14-year-olds out there thinking, I want to do this. And, to parents who have these children in their worlds.
I think for young people wanting to start a business, it would really come down to two key things. The first one is the value of mentorship. I think as a young person, sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and finding mentors, people to learn from, are so important. The amount of investors that I talk to every day that always say they invest in founders, not ideas, it really drills home that point that it's not necessarily about your idea, it's about you as a founder. And if you can learn from people that you want to be more like, yeah, that is the first way, the first key to success. Because your first few ideas, they might not work. Even for myself, I went from selling hearings to building holograms to education and to consulting. I've worked on so many different businesses, but it's been building my skill sets. And I
How
think
many
the
mentors,
second,
sorry, just to jump in there,
yeah,
how many mentors did you have at that point in time?
I think when I started, I had about three or four key mentors that I caught up with pretty frequently, normally about once a month, and would just jump on Zoom calls, Teams calls, catch up for coffees whenever I could around my schedule and theirs, just to chat through, find out what they're up to, what lessons they've learned, share the challenges and the things I'm working on, and get their feedback on that. So that was
Mm,
really key.
mm.
And then I think the other one is I always talk to young people about the concept of creating your personal elevator pitch. And it's about thinking around, what are you passionate about? What are you good at? And what do you value? And I think if you can find something that sits into the intersection of that, that'll be so, so powerful. And that's whether you want to start a business, or even if you're just looking to get a head start as a young leader, going to networking events. I think we're so often to pigeonhole ourselves. You go to a networking event and someone says, "Hey, Sadhana, who are you?" I might say, "Oh, I'm an accountant. Nice to meet you." I'm like, "Oh, that's great." But what if you said, "Well, look, I'm really passionate about helping animals through my skills in financial literacy to help achieve a better world," something like that. It just
Yeah.
opens you to so many more conversations, so many more opportunities. And I think these days, as we navigate a future of work where there are so many job titles appearing every single day that we might not have seen before, that personal elevator pitch opens you to so many more opportunities.
Yeah, great advice. So what's next for you and your business?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think what's next for us is it's creating a really clear pipeline for students from school to industry. That's something that I'm really passionate about. I know from seeing our students over the past, I'd say 7 years since we ran our first education program, we have some really phenomenal top young talent coming through the ranks these days. This next generation, they're finishing school, they're going on to further study, they're heading out into industry, and I must admit, they're pretty outstanding. I feel pretty confident about the state of the world. But I think it's around creating those links for them into industry, making sure that they're paired with organizations that really do understand those intergenerational collaborations. Again, they're not just talking the talk, they're also walking the walk. They've got the programs, the supports, the structures in place to really capture that next generation of top young talent and integrate them with their teams and help them to soar. I think that's something that I'm really excited about and investigating further.
Mm. Well, good luck with that. And I hope you get access to many, many students with the programs that you run. Now, we're at the part of the program where I ask you our 4 questions that we ask all of our guests. So I'll start off by, if you had to describe a future fit leader in just 3 words, the kind of leader we will need to start seeing in the years ahead, what would they be and why?
I think a future fit leader that is truly prepared for an ever changing future of work, they're authentic, they're innovative, and they're adaptable. They're authentic in their approaches, they're thinking outside of the box, they're pushing themselves outside of their comfort zones, and they're willing to adapt to emerging trends, to new opportunities, and challenges that arise.
I like that. What's one future shift coming in the next few years that you think most leaders are underestimating and are not prepared for?
I think it's Generation Z in the workforce. Gen
Mm.
Z, they're getting through their study, they're entering industry, and they're really shaking things up. And I think a lot of leaders are still of the mindset that Gen Z need to adapt to the way things have always been done. But I think what we're going to find is that leaders are going to have to adapt to Gen Z instead.
And if they don't adapt, then there's a whole generation of people we will not be able to employ, really, at the end of the day.
Exactly. I mean, between Gen Z and Gen Alpha, that's 2.2 billion people globally. That is a massive segment of employees and consumers that leaders will be missing out on if they don't adapt.
Well, we don't have a choice, really. We have businesses to run, so we need to adapt, right? So, what do you wish more leaders were paying closer attention to?
I think the shift in values and what a successful career, what a successful life looks like. I think younger generations, they're rethinking the great Australian dream of home ownership, of working 9 to 5 careers and career progression. They're instead
Mm.
opting for Euro summers, for flexible work environments. They're wanting work-life balance. And I think that's something that leaders need to pay a bit more attention to. What does success look like for the next generation?
That is so true because instead of losing someone to 6 weeks because they want to go and travel Europe, you should be able to say to them, go, but keep up with your work or agree to work X number of days for the time that you're away. And then when you come back, we'll click you back into your full-time role again.
Absolutely. And I think we're seeing that become a non-negotiable for so many young people.
Yeah.
And I've seen so many examples of companies that have lost top talent because of that, but also companies that have been able to gain top talent for a lower salary package because they offer that flexibility.
Mm. What do you wish leaders were paying more attention to right now?
I wish they were paying more attention to the reimagining of a standard 9 to 5. I think
Mm.
we're really rethinking, why do we have office spaces? What do our office spaces look like? Why do we insist everyone starts work at 9 a.m. and finishes at 5 p.m.? I think the leaders that are saying, well, look, if you work better in the morning, fine, log on at 6 a.m. and log off at 2 p.m. If you work better in the evening, log on at 6 p.m., log off at 2 a.m. Work when you are best, because I think there is so much lost productivity to people that are forced to be chained to their desk in times that they're just not productive mentally.
Mm. And the biggest fear leaders have is that work isn't going to be done, but you'll find out real quickly if the work isn't being done. So, you rather keep a good employee than worry about the work.
And I think it's a sign potentially of a subpar leader. If
Mm.
they think that productivity is someone sitting at their desk from 9 to 5, I think we need to be changing our mindset from how many hours did you work to what was your output.
Yeah.
I think from my perspective, if I have a team member that can do the work of a full-time staff member in 2 days a week, I'm happy to pay them a full-time salary because I still get that work,
You get the
and then
output.
they get some more flexibility.
Yeah. What other possibilities or shifts you see in the future of leadership or work that genuinely excites you and why? Now, I'm interested to hear your answer on this one.
One shift that I see in the future of leadership that really excites me is the idea of reverse mentoring. Now, mentoring has been around for a very long time. You pair a senior executive with a junior staff member or an emerging leader for learning opportunities. The idea of reverse mentoring is the learning goes both ways. Every time you catch up, everyone has something to learn and something to teach. And I think with this, we're going to see baby boomers and Gen Zs coming together, really established leaders and emerging leaders coming together to share their thoughts, to share their experiences, and they're both going to grow as a result of that. And that really excites me.
That excites me as well, because I do agree with you that there is so much value and merit in that. I don't normally do this, but I will today, is just ask another question on that. How do you see that working? Like, do you see it being managed? Because sometimes when you've got that age difference and the experience difference, it may not work so well. How would you make sure that it works well for both parties?
I think there needs to be upskilling on both sides. I think
Mm.
before engaging in the reverse mentoring program, both participants, those senior executives and those emerging leaders, they both need to do their own professional development to build understanding, to build appreciation, and to build the skills and techniques they need to engage in a useful dialogue. And I think for me, I work quite closely with the deputy principal on a particular event that we run every year, a conference for educators. She's been teaching for longer than I've been alive. We figured out last year, and we have some really dynamic conversations, and our collaboration is one of my favorite. And then really it is reverse mentoring. But it always comes down to, and this collaboration, the reason it's successful is we both have a shared respect for each other
Yeah.
and our experiences, and a shared trust that we both are looking for the best out of that collaboration. And I think you've got to establish that first.
Good advice. Scott, last question. If you could embed one leadership quality into every current and future CEO, something that you believe will be essential in the next decade, what would that be and why?
I think it's the ability, I would say it's humility. It's understanding that the best ideas don't always come from the top. It's being confident enough and vulnerable enough to say, look, I don't know what the answer is. What do you guys think? To actually listen to their team and to then be able to say, well, look, the best idea maybe didn't come from me as a leader. It came from someone else. And I'm going to give them the acknowledgement that they deserve for coming up with that idea, but then let's run with that as a team. I think that humility is absolutely key.
Scott Millar, you have been amazing to talk to you. And I know I keep saying this, but I can because I'm so much older than you. But it is so wonderful to see someone so young have such a depth of experience and ambition. And I really look forward to watching what you have got in store for the rest of the world as you grow your business and everything else that you're involved in. So good luck with all of that. And it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you so much for having me, Sadhna. It's been such a delight to chat to you today, and I can't wait to continue following the podcast in years to come.
If you like what you've heard, please share, rate and review this podcast. And don't forget to share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing it. The producer of Future Fit Leadership is Maritza Barone from Guide Your Light Network. If you would like to reach out to me, please DM me on any of my social media platforms. I'm available for speaking at conferences or consulting to your business. Future Fit is created in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives. If you'd like to join the community and receive a free takeaway each week, sign up to the Future Exchange app in my show notes. Thank you for having me in your space.
This is a Guide Your Light Network production, creating podcasts with purpose.